How much Americans love heroes. Action heroes, especially. And not action heroes that necessarily blow everything up, but action heroes that figure out a way to get through situations that seem impossible. You know, that the odds are overwhelming and the situation and what they must do to get out of it is ridiculous. I mean, I'm a particular fan. I love Indiana Jones. And, he swims after a submarine to get in the submarine. And you watch that scene as it goes away. Did you ever ask how he gets in the submarine? No, because he's Indiana Jones. He's going to figure it out. Or James Bond, the opening scenes on James Bond as he rides a motorcycle over the marketplace in Istanbul or shoots off of the top of the Alps and parachutes down. I mean, it's impossible, right? But somehow we like it. They figure out and they get out of tense situations. Who here watched MacGyver? Remember MacGyver? MacGyver could start a car with duct tape and a toothpick. He could do anything. And some of us here are old enough to recall Maxwell Smart. Yeah, I got an older congregation at this service, I can tell you. Maxwell Smart, who was kind of a goofball, right? He was kind of a goofball, but he always got out of the situations somehow, in some way. Do you remember his shoe? His shoe was a telephone, and we all thought it was ridiculous. I bet you don't think it's so crazy anymore, do you? Well, anyway, my point is we love individuals who are creative in cramped spaces and critical situations. We love that. It intrigues us. We love people who make things work when everybody else says it's all done. Which is what I think this story that Jesus tells is about. Here we have an individual, stay with me now. Here we have an individual who's going to lose his job. Writings on the wall. It doesn't say he stole or necessarily embezzled. It says he kind of wasted what wasn't his. He wasted what the word in Greek is kyrios. It says master. It really means Lord. His boss, his CEO, he wasted it. He squandered. They didn't make their quarterlies that year, and this man had a lot of good dinners as he wined and dined clients. I'm willing to bet there's a few of you out there who have probably maxed out the corporate card, right? This guy did that. That's what he was doing. And he saw the writing on the wall. He says, man, the boss is going to come home and I'm going to be let go. So rather than despair, he says, I'm going to figure this out. He goes out and he finds the creditors to the corporation and he says, how much do you owe? 1,000 gallons of wine? Make it 500 and pay it up today and it's done. And how much wheat do you owe? 80? Make it 40. Pay it all off now. You're set to go. Now, what would you think if you were the boss and you came home and all your profit was cut in half and this guy hands you all the receipts? Would you think that he should be charged with embezzlement? Do you think he should be thrown in jail? What do you think? What would you do? The text says, the boss says, well played. Now, this is interesting because if you explore what this guy did, there are two reasons behind his actions that would cause this kind of response from his boss. The first is the boss's ego's on the line. The boss's ego's on the line. He knows that the worst thing that can happen to him out in society and in the corporate world is that every other business that he's going to do business with would look and say, what a fool are you? This guy got away with that. Weren't you watching the shop? How'd you let this happen? Didn't you evaluate him? What were you doing? He's thinking, who's going to do business with me when this guy got away with this? Now, you may think this is ridiculous, but look at Wells Fargo. 5,200 employees, right? Made up all these accounts, and sure, they got fired, but whose head are they calling for now? the CEO. He may or may not have had anything to do with this or any knowledge of it, but you're going to come down too. And this guy says, if I'm going down, you're going down with me. And then he plays the game, and we've all done this one too, of you owe me. You owe me, man. He went to these creditors and he said, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to get you out of this debt, but don't forget you owe me. And in the first century, the rules of, you got to help me, reciprocity. Anybody say that better than me? Thank you very much. You're awake. Good. He knew that that's how it worked, that if he got fired, he could go back to these people. Look, I did you a favor. You owe me. You owe me. And so caught between a rock and a hard place, what is the boss supposed to do except say, well played. Well played. Anybody here watch the television show Survivor? You do. I know you do. You should be on it, by the way. I think you would win it. Anybody else? Nobody here watches Survivor? My family has been addicted to that show since, I think, 1890. And nobody? Really? Nobody? Does anybody else know it, or do I have to explain the whole thing? I know you watch it back there. I know, because we talk about it. Well, Survivor is a reality show, right, where they take 20 people, they put them on an island, and they compete with intellectual games and physical games, and they have to build a shelter, and they have to do all these things to survive. And then every week they vote somebody off. That's how they do it. They vote somebody off until they get to the end, and they really should go down to 2, but they go to 3. Those who are into the show understand what I'm talking about. Anyway, they vote people off, and they vote them off because they don't like how they look or how they act, or they think they're a threat, and there's $1 million reward at the end, right? That's the way the show goes. In fact, some of the challenges they play, you can win immunity, which means when you go to the vote, when they vote somebody off, they can't vote for you. Somebody in the church knew I watched Survivor, and they made me an immunity idol, which I keep in my pocket, so if you ever decide to vote me off the island, I can play it. Right? Anyway, these people scheme and they talk and everything. But at the end, there are 3 people left, and all the people who have been voted off get to vote for which one of those 3 they think is the best survivor. And of course, as they stand up and talk about it, some of them remember some nasty things that were done to them. But the interesting thing is, in the very end, no matter how that one person treated all the rest of them, that the vote comes down to how well they played the game. They throw out all the other stuff and say, you played the game well, because the mantra and the goal of the game is to outplay, outwit, outlast. You win. Now, I acknowledge that none of this fits very well into our portfolio of what we think is appropriate for Jesus' teaching. After all, by our standards, going back to our scripture now, this manager should be prosecuted. This manager should pay for what he's done. And even in the first century, the people up here could do anything they wanted to the people down here. He should be locked up away forever. And if his family doesn't feed him, he's going to die. But that's by standards today, not by standards then. And whenever we read the scriptures, remember, you have to think about the standards then. And then if you flip it over and you put this scripture into the context, not merely of when Jesus spoke it, 30 A.D., but when Luke wrote it down in 90 A.D., 60 years later, Luke remembered this story for a reason. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't have it. But Luke remembers it for a reason, because he is preaching to the early church. He is talking to people who really didn't even know Jesus at the time. He's talking to folks who need a specific message that Jesus said something that's relevant to them at that time. And in 90 A.D., the early church was very fragile. It was in fierce competition with other religions and the secular society and the power of Rome. Its very survival was at stake. And Luke recalls this story, I would submit to you, saying you're going to have to be resourceful. You're going to have to outwit, outplay, outlast, because it is a challenging world. You know, the early Christians expected Jesus to come back any moment, and when he didn't, they have to figure out, what does this mean for the long haul? We all love that saying, don't we? When the going gets tough, when the going gets tough, yeah, we love that, but it's so much easier to say than do. And in the church, we say that, but we shy away from it because somehow we have this image that we are always supposed to be passive and lay down and just kind of allow things to go wherever they will go. But these words, you know, because Jesus also said, be wise as serpent and as gentle as doves. These words are as relevant or more so today than they were even in the first century. Because society in our time is more dismissive of church and religious institutions than ever in my lifetime. You know, years back, real estate developers used to give congregations, 3 or 4 acres of land and say, build on it, because you building on this is going to help me sell homes, because people will see a good neighborhood, they'll see some place they want to be, that the church represented that. Today, in Florida, we're zoned commercial. The church is considered a commercial institution, with many people viewing us as an infringement. That is, they always like to say we are tax-free or tax-exempt, which really they don't know the tax laws well, because that's not entirely true, but that's what they like to say. And many of them would rather that we just went away. You know, when we were having the struggle over the parking lot and the youth, I remember reading one person's comment on the internet that said, the solution to this problem is to just tear down the church and make it a parking lot, and that will benefit everybody more. Now, you may be shocked at that, but I'm telling you that is more the norm than not. It is the growing perception in our society. And standing and shouting and screaming isn't going to change it. Rather, this parable speaks to us that we must be at our best, not being naive or ignorant, but by locking arms to bring the talents and the skills and the wisdom that we all have corporately together to change the world, to better society, not just to care for our own, and sometimes that means going head to head with the world. Lest our story ends differently than the one with his steward. Because we want when we meet our Maker, we want our Maker to say, well played. My previous church owned property. They owned a retreat center on 4 beautiful acres in which you could see the lake. They bought this with great big dreams and so forth, but it was a huge retreat center, and attached to it was an old mansion. And the first clue that this might not work over the time is the Catholic Church owned this property before my church did, and they couldn't manage it. Right? Anyway, the church owned this for a number of years, and it worked well for a few things, but it was losing $60,000 to $80,000 a year for the church. And it's a long story as to why, but approximately that. And the church came to the consensus that it's time we cut this thing loose. We get rid of that, which would be, no one knew, about a 4-year battle. Because the church, owning the property, put it on the market for the fair market value, somewhere around $2 million. But the church had been so generous over the years, letting the community use the property to practice soccer, to have picnics, to have all kinds of gatherings there, that they said, no, you're not going to sell it. That's ours. We control it. We own it. And so every deal we brought to the table, they fought, and the city began to stand behind them. The mayor and I were in the Chicago Tribune frequently over this issue. And the church worked very, very hard to bring things to the sale. They weren't going to sell it for condominiums. They weren't going to sell it for... They wanted to do something that would benefit the community and be unique. And one person we brought to the table was a gentleman in Chicago who bought old mansions. They bought old mansions. And then he would renovate them. He had the capital to renovate them. And he'd do wedding receptions. And so when you had the reception, it was in this mansion, and your pictures were on the mantle, and it was beautiful, with a big circling carriageway in front of it and so forth. And so we thought, well, we'll work this through. This is a great deal. We'll invite the neighbors in, and the neighbors can talk to him. And he presented, and they just ripped him apart. And he turned to me, and he said, Keith, these people obviously do their wedding receptions at the VFW. Because all of a sudden they started complaining, well, if he does wedding receptions, there'll be drunk drivers. Well, the country club was right around the corner, and those guys drank all the time. Are you kidding me? Anyway, it went on, and the value of the property went from $2.1 million down to $1.2 million. Nobody would touch it, especially when the mayor decided they'd put a historic plaque on the mansion, which meant that you couldn't touch anything without meeting all these expensive codes. Well, it all came down to a city council meeting that was jam-packed. It was like the OK Corral. My people on this side and the neighbors and the city people on this side. It's going to be Armageddon. The mayor calls a timeout. And he says, Keith, let's talk. And so we go into a private room, and I used words that I had to confess later on, I think, in the conversation. But he asked me, what will it take for you to sell this church, now get this, to my people? Not the church, the property. And I looked at him as I pointed at him and said, you have to quit messing around with my church. Number one. Okay, he says, and what? And I said, you have 30 days to come up with $1.5 million. And you know that street that's between the church and the parking? I want the city to give that to us. I want that property. I want it for free. 30 days later, we had $1.5 million, and at a midnight meeting, that street was given to the church. Just upset a bunch of other neighbors, but I didn't care about them. They weren't my issue. They were his, right? 4 years. 4 years. Wise as serpent, gentle as doves. There comes that point when, why are we here? What do we stand for? And are we willing to stand up for it? This morning when I came to church, I was chagrined to find another citation from the city for parking. We did go before the magistrate in July, and the ruling, as we read it and as our attorney informed us, said that as long as people could park here for free and only gave donations to our youth, that was it. I guess the city doesn't buy it. After all, remember, churches are zoned commercial. You see, they don't understand us. They don't understand us. And some people really believe, it'd be better off if you just tore this all down and made it a parking lot. What's my point? My point is these are very challenging times. They are times that call forth our best, our best smarts, our best wisdom, our best ability at understanding the law, not to be mean or retaliatory or vengeful, but smart. These may be the most challenging times the church has faced in our generation. It's a competitive world out there for everything. It's a commercial world for everything. They are competitive and they're commercial, seeking our resources, our time, our talent, our treasure, our wit, our wisdom, our expertise, but most of all, our loyalty. You know, all through all this value system, Jesus is asking, well, what's important to you? It is a challenge that we can face, and I submit to you that in some way we must win or just become relegated more and more to the periphery of society until we do not matter at all. And there's three ways we engage this. One is we have to acknowledge the world in which we live. We have to not turn from it or deny it. We have to accept the realities of it. And secondly, we must stand and face the challenges of it. And thirdly, as the parable says, we have to just get smart so that someday maybe we'll hear, well done, well played. Amen.